Self-care is when I identify a legitimate need that I have, and then I meet that need in a legitimate way. And I can do that by myself. I can do that in community. I can do that with resources. In God's creation, God created us to be needful, and then God also provides the resources in order for us to meet that need legitimately. In coping, I do have a need, and that need may be acknowledged or not acknowledged, but instead of trying to meet that need in a legitimate way, I'm finding maybe unhealthy, inappropriate, illegitimate ways to meet that need. And if I'm doing that, what's happening is the legitimate need is still not being met. And so if I'm exiting my pain, I'm still not addressing the pain. If I'm medicating my anxiety through some sort of behavior or substance, I'm still not addressing the anxiety. Part of a coping strategy is an attempt to bypass or avoid something that we feel is too challenging or difficult or painful for us to address in a healthy way.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, together here with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, how are you?
Good to be here.
Greg has come in from Chicago to lead our Men's Journey workshop again this week. And so we take advantage of his presence by doing more podcasts. And we are lucky to have with us today Debbie Laaser. Debbie, welcome.
Thank you.
We're always excited when Debbie is here because she brings so much experience, knowledge, and charm to the podcast. Yeah, we're a little short on
That's right. We may be missing the charm on this end of the table.
A little low on charm over here. But today we have brought Debbie in, and we're going to be talking about
coping strategies.
Coping strategies. I already forgot. Coping strategies dealing with behavior.
Correct. And one of the things that we were talking about is we were talking about different topics and things that we could discuss is the idea of, for first, us getting clear about the language, how we use coping strategies versus how somebody else might use it. And you may hear for some people that coping strategy is seen as a positive thing, that if life is difficult, we might have those positive ways to cope. And we just want to kind of use some of our time to clarify that when we talk about coping strategies, we're always going to be talking about it in a negative way. And then the alternative is what we would call healthy self-care. And so just at the beginning, you may have a therapist or someone that you work with that talks about healthy coping. And the purpose of the language here at Faithful and True, we're going to refer to that as self-care. So anytime we're talking about coping strategies, we're talking about those things that take us out of our reality or cause us to exit our lives.
Yes, or take us out of difficult situations or emotions. So sometimes they're conscious, sometimes they're unconscious because we've been doing them for so long that we actually since little children, that we don't even realize we slip into coping in terms of managing a difficult situation.
Right.
But I would add also that if someone you're working with or talking with uses the term healthy coping, that's fine. We just thought we would let you know we do it differently here. We like to distinguish between self-care, which is actually a decision to do possibly the exact same thing, only it's a decision for our well-being instead of for exiting a difficult situation.
Well, and kind of the way I would talk about self-care is when I identify a legitimate need that I have, and then I meet that need in a legitimate way. And I can do that by myself. I can do that in community. I can do that with resources. But it really begins with the recognition that I have a legitimate need. And then in God's creation, God created us to be needful. And then God also provides the resources in order for us to meet that need legitimately. In coping, what the idea is, I do have a need. And that need may be acknowledged or not acknowledged, but instead of trying to meet that need in a legitimate way, I'm finding maybe unhealthy, inappropriate, illegitimate ways to meet that need. And if I'm doing that, what's happening is the legitimate need is still not being met. And so if I'm exiting my pain, I'm still not addressing the pain. If I'm medicating my anxiety through some sort of behavior or substance, I'm still not addressing the anxiety. And so we want people to understand that part of a coping strategy is an attempt to bypass or avoid something that we feel is too challenging or difficult or painful for us to address in a healthy way.
And therefore, I believe it's a truth that when we're coping, or we use the term too, sitting in our survivor chair, that we're pulling ourselves out of healthy relationship. So our main goal is to comfort ourselves. I like those terms because sometimes we're not talking about major problems, major difficulties, but we may be uncomfortable with something. And so we choose some way or another to help ourselves feel more comfortable.
Right.
I think it's time to get into some examples because it's hard sometimes to understand what a legitimate solution is. But let's just say I notice, for instance, that at the workshops, when we first start a women's workshop, for instance, and before we have talked about various things, what could be happening is a lot of people are on their phones, looking at email, or maybe they're looking at social media. I don't know what they're looking at. Maybe they're shopping. But the truth is that it's probably fairly uncomfortable because most people that come to a workshop here don't know anyone. And so it makes sense if I could get busy or do something with these few minutes, I could just kind of calm myself down. So a good way of doing that might be pulling out a phone. And I think these days, a lot of people have turned to screens of some kind to take care of uncomfortable situations.
You know, what's interesting is if I'm older, so I didn't grow up with a cell phone. But what's also true is I did grow up with screen time. And for me growing up, it was the TV. The TV was regularly on in our home. I often tell the story of when I was in the third grade, we moved from one community to another. We moved from Oklahoma to Texas. And it was an incredibly painful move for all of us. In hindsight, I realized that as a child, I didn't know that. But the reality is we never talked about that. We never checked in with each other. My parents weren't really asking, how is it going? But what's true is I would get home from this new school that had been so difficult, so painful, and what my mom and I would do is we would watch TV. And we would sit on the couch. I knew what shows were going to be on. It was 2 shows that we enjoyed, and we really didn't connect. And being with my mom, watching TV wasn't the most destructive thing. And what's also true is probably what I needed more was my mom's ability to be with me in the difficulty of my school experience, for her to be able to be aware of how painful it was to move. What I also think is true, though, is my mom was going through her own chaos and pain because when we left Oklahoma, we moved away from everything that she was familiar with. We moved away from her family. And so my assumption is she didn't know how to be with me in my chaos because she wasn't sure how to be with herself in her own pain and chaos. And TV became the connector. And I did feel connected to my mom while we were watching the same show, but we really weren't connected to each other. So it makes sense for those of us who grew up in the TV age, and TV was a part of our family system growing up, that was the original screen time. So now, years later, we've just transferred that to our phone and other things that we can watch or escape using technology.
You know, it's interesting when I talked about how our coping choices pull us out of relationships. So in some ways, sitting there side by side watching TV, there is still some connection. But when you think about it, what would the connection have been like if your mom had been able to start a conversation and just say to you, you know, what I realize is moving is so hard. I don't really have a lot of good friends to talk to. I have to start all over. Sometimes that's really frustrating, whatever.
Right.
And that would have opened up an immediate conversation with you to say, well, that's happening to me at school too.
Absolutely.
And that kind of sharing, again, is what we call emotional intimacy.
Right.
And that's the kind of sharing that we know when we don't do much of that, we can end up doing a lot of coping because it's so essential to our well-being. And in fact, that's one of the definitions of sexual addiction, and I think any addiction, is that we're disconnected emotionally with people. And so we learn to do things, some more harmful than others, but the truth is we pull ourselves out of potentially some healthy relationships.
Yeah, I've often thought, especially as I've started doing my own work, how meaningful it would have been if my mom had begun that conversation with how difficult the the move was for her, because I could speculate about that. I had some beliefs about that. But in the absence of that information, I didn't know how to talk to her about what was going on for me. And what's interesting is we could talk about the show. So it was for you older people, was I Love Lucy and the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Classic.
And yes. And so we could talk about what ridiculousness Lucy was going. We could laugh together. We could talk about the Petries and what was going on in Dick Van
Why
Dyke
does he
Show.
always trip over the ottoman?
Yes, the tripping. And so there was this sense of connection, but like we were saying, there was this need that was beyond that I don't know either one of us knew how to move towards that. And I just needed my mom to be able to take the initiative to move towards me. And as we're talking about this, we are going to be talking about different ways of coping. And the first thing we're going to be talking about is behavioral coping. And kind of like what Randy said, is what are some of the behaviors out there that we can use and gravitate towards? And what complicates it, it's not necessarily what I'm doing, it's what part of me is doing it. You mentioned this idea of the survivor chair. We talk a lot of that here. And so if I'm moving towards TV out of my wise adult and I'm taking a moment to enjoy a show, that's very different than if I'm using it as a survivor strategy to escape whatever pain and chaos I might be experiencing in my life, or as an attempt to avoid connection with somebody else.
I think what might be helpful for our listeners today is just to invite you all to think about what are some of the earliest memories you have of how you did cope. And as we talk about some things, maybe some of those memories will come up and you can think of some. I think it would also be helpful to talk about a couple of the earliest things we learn to do to cope when life is hard. The very oldest that I have run into in my research and reading is what we would call dissociation. Dissociation is when we learn as a very young person, when we're in a difficult situation, oftentimes it might be an abusive situation, physical abuse, sexual abuse, so forth, that we literally have the ability to kind of take ourselves out of our body and float on the ceiling, so to speak, dissociate from the situation. When you think about it, it's a very creative thing that God created in our bodies to do, because as young people, we have very little resources to do anything else. We don't have cars to get away. We don't have money to go to a hotel. We can't call friends on the phone. We're really pretty stuck. But dissociation, for those who have been very traumatized early in life and know that that's how they really survived that very difficult situation, was to almost remove themselves and watch what was happening without having to be there and experience it themselves. I would guess that many of you who have had trauma in the early stages of your life know what it means to numb yourself out and to dissociate. And, Mark and I have had in the days some really interesting conversations because his trauma started very early in life. And I did not have that kind of trauma. So in a way, it was hard for me to understand what that kind of coping even meant. And it came out one time when we were talking about an accident that a good friend of mine who was teaching with me at the time was in, and it actually killed her. At that time, Mark was working as a part-time pastor while he was in graduate school, and her husband asked him to lead the service, her funeral service, and he said, of course, he would be very happy to do that. So when we went to that service, I'm sitting in the back, crying and kind of beside myself, this very good friend I just lost because of this tragic accident. And Mark is up there speaking this eloquent, sermon. And at the end, I said to him, how in the world do you do that? I could never do that. I just can't. And he goes, I learned how to dissociate years ago. And it was really my first introduction to that word and what it even meant, that it is, like we talk about a lot in terms of sexual addiction and wives who don't get it either, that compartmentalizing. How can you say you love me and still be doing what you're doing? And in a way, that comes from probably this very traumatic coping behavior that was established early in life called dissociation.
Well, and part of it is the realization is if something incredibly painful and difficult is happening, I cannot let it touch me. Because if it comes too close to me, it's going to consume me. And so the strategy is I keep it at a distance. And so it's almost like another image would be I'm able to put up this force field around myself so whatever is going on in reality can't get all the way to me. And so in that particular case, Mark was surrounded by this grief. Mark was surrounded by the loss. He could see it. He could experience it. But he also had the capacity to put up this force field that kept it from getting completely to him. And, you mentioned this earlier, and a lot of times we can do this without even realizing that we're doing it. All we have to do is perceive a possible threat, an actual threat, somebody coming towards us, or a circumstantial threat. This is going to be too difficult or painful. And the force field goes up before we're even aware of it. And, it is interesting how that same force field that protects us can be incredibly painful for those who are around us who don't understand it or who have been negatively impacted by it.
And like you said, it can show up later in life. I mean, I know if we were having a conversation that wasn't going well, or we were having a lot of tension, I mean, I could almost tell through Mark's eyes that he sort of left, and before we knew what to call this, it was really another time when he was dissociating, probably fear of what I was going to say or do or whatever. And so he would call it the land of numb. And he would just go to this land of numb. So he could kind of block out what I was saying or whatever. When I was done, then he'd say, okay, back to a sports show or something else, that he was using. So we all can do that around something typically. But those who have been very traumatized in life have an extra skill, I would say, at doing that. Another coping mechanism that I think would be good to talk about that's very early on in most people's lives that use it is lying. It's another one of those coping mechanisms that we don't need money for. We don't need a car. We don't need a place to go. When we don't have people around to talk to, we can learn how to lie when things get really difficult. And so maybe I'd have you talk about it, because I know that's something that generally creates a lot of trouble in the relationships we work with here between those who have struggled with addiction.
Well, and I would absolutely say that was one of the early coping strategies that I learned. And I often tell men, if you're really good at hiding, lying, and deception, it's because you witnessed it growing up. It was modeled for you in some way. And I'll mention the story of the family that's going to church and everybody's yelling and screaming, but as soon as they pull in the parking lot, everybody pretends like everything is okay. Well, as a little boy, you're kind of observing this and you're beginning to realize, oh, there's a public perspective and there's a secret or hidden perspective or private perspective. So when we're at church, we act this way. When we're in the car, we act this way. Or it's a parent who is raging and then the phone rings and then with a very calm voice, they have a conversation with somebody on the phone. Well, again, the little boy's recognizing, okay, or little girl too, this is how you act in public, this is how you act in private. Or it could be just that certain topics are discussed and some aren't. I know in some families you're actually told you cannot tell anybody about this outside of the family, or don't ever talk about this again. So we just learn observing, experiencing what it is to say, okay, one of the ways you create safety is by hiding, lying, and deception. And I do think that distinction is helpful, because for some people, when they hear lying, they feel like there has to be a verbal denial of something. And for a lot of people, that is it. They're asked, did you do this? They say no. But there's a lot of ways that we deceive. I for myself, I use the example of the illusionist. I would get people to look up here and get their attention here, but all of the chaos was back here that I wanted to distract them from. One of the ways that we hide and lie and deceive is through distraction. And I do think that when we learn this as a child, and I think, this idea of perceived threat is so important, because if you're in an environment where there is a real threat, and the real threat is coming from a source that is supposed to be safe, it is so incongruent that you begin to be suspicious that everything is a threat. Every conversation is a threat. Every interaction is a threat. And so anybody who has energy is a threat. And so you immediately fall into these coping strategies, these safety mechanisms. So like you said with Mark, y'all could just be having an argument about something. It could get a lot of tense. Maybe your energy went up, and immediately he was disconnecting or disassociating because he perceived that as a threat. I know for me, it could be as simple as there's something going on that I want to share, but I feel anxiety about it. And if I'm not careful, I let that anxiety shut me down and not share something that would be helpful for someone to know. Or if I continue to keep it to myself, it actually then becomes deception. So I do think that hiding, lying, deception thing is significant. And it's one of the things that makes addiction possible when we discover it. You know, what's true is most of us that are addicts and have been addicts for a while is because we learned how to hide certain things. Well, typically the hiding and the lying precede the addiction. And when the addiction comes along, we already know how to hide it. I really see this, I hear these stories of the young man, little boy who was caught looking at pornography, or somebody walked in and they were masturbating, and the reaction of the parent or whoever found them was rage, anger, threats. And what ends up happening is the little boy realizes, oh, it's not that I'm going to give this up. I just have to get better at hiding it. And they just make a pledge, I'm not going to get caught doing this again. And maybe temporarily they believe they're not going to do it again. But when it does come back, they want to hide it even better. So I think part of the work, and we really talk about this at the workshop, is if I'm going to be in recovery, I have to move from the language of hiding, lying, and deception and begin to be fluent in the language of honesty and authenticity and transparency.
I know one of the research components of lying is that children are unreasonably punished. And so it does make sense that when punishment is unreasonable, because they're trying to avoid pain, that they will lie about something in an effort to avoid that. And I think, as you were saying, there are other things like protecting our self-esteem. When there's an expectation that you need to look a certain way or behave a certain way, and if you know that doesn't fit who you are, you can just figure out a lie to make it so. And so I think kids in school start doing that a lot. What'd you do on the test today? It did really great. When the expectation was that they would bring home all A's and that wasn't happening, then they might start lying about that or figuring out how to hide what was going on. I think it's really helpful, again, when we're trying to understand why somebody else uses the coping mechanism they do, is how there might be a little bit of it we've had in our own life at times. I went on a little research project of my own a few years ago, just really watching myself. And when little, they weren't giant lies, but they were little ones. And I noticed one of them was coming up when I would go visit my mom and dad in their senior community. And usually the first question they would ask me is, how was your drive? Because it's a ways. And at first I was really honest, like, oh my gosh, the snowstorm was pretty bad. And, I pulled off for a while and this and that. And they go, oh my gosh, I was worried about that. And you just should not come here in the winter at all. It's just too much. You shouldn't do that. Well, I'm thinking, I'm going to not visit for an entire winter season. So what did I learn to say the next time? How was your road trip? It was great.
Right.
It was fine. Everything went fine. And this day, it's what I always say, because I don't want them to worry. And I don't want them to start giving me ideas about when I should and shouldn't travel and visit. I'm like, I'm an adult. I will make those good decisions on my own. So it's interesting. I mean, it might not seem like a big thing, but I'm definitely stepping across what's true because I want to keep the peace in that moment.
Well, and if we're looking at the continuum, from, let's say, 1 to 5, 1 is occasionally I may bend the truth in order to manage a situation. To 5, I'm bold-faced lying or hiding significant events. Yeah. Somebody may be listening and they'll recognize, I'm more at the 1 and the 2. But if I can own the fact that I'm at a 1 or 2, that may give me more compassion for the person who's at the 5. Because I can at least understand it on some scale. I may not be lying to the extent that somebody else is, but I can understand why someone might use hiding and lying and deception as a way to create safety or a big thing is to manage somebody else's reaction or the outcome to something.
Yeah, exactly. Building empathy, I think, comes through not comparing apples to oranges here, because definitely that is not a comparison to lying about being unfaithful. It does, however, create a little bit of empathy, which again helps us move a little bit forward in our relationships to understand it at some level. And, and I think it can take us out of our self-righteous place when I would never do that or I would never do that. I mean, I can remember thinking, we never lied in our family, kind of a never always kind of thing.
Yeah.
We never lied, never had to lie about anything. The more I thought about it and did my research project, I'm like, it did come up,
Right.
in terms of how old are you when you go to the theme park, and if you're 11 instead of 12, it makes a difference.
Right.
And, so there'd be some of those kind of fibs going on. But anyway, building empathy about just why we cope. And again, it's for ourselves. It's to comfort ourselves and to manage something in our life that feels unmanageable or painful. And it's not generally about trying to figure out what we need to do to somebody else.
Right. The other thing I would say, and you've said it, but I want to say it again, this isn't an excuse for somebody's behavior. So we're not saying if somebody is hiding and lying, it's no big deal, or because they learned it in childhood, they can't change. This is an understanding. And the reality is, if I don't understand where I learned it and I don't understand why I do it, it's going to be incredibly difficult for me to change the behavior as an adult.
Exactly.
And so, for those of you that have been significantly hurt by your spouse's deception, and I've often heard you and the other women at Faithful and True say that the sexual addiction was very painful, and a significant part of the pain was the hiding and lying and deception. So we want to acknowledge that. But for those of us that learned as a child hiding and lying as a coping strategy, as a way to create safety, it gives me a new context to say, okay, if historically I used that to create safety, and now as an adult I find legitimate ways to create safety, I won't need the old illegitimate ways to do that. And I can use the truth to create safety. I can acknowledge I may share this and someone may be angry at me or disappointed at me, but I can still be safe. I can share this and somebody may have a reaction, but even with that reaction, I can be safe. Or I can share this and maybe there's going to be consequences, but even in those consequences, I can be safe. When I can get grounded in that truth as a wise adult, then I'm less likely to fall back to the old patterns.
I would just remind our listeners, too, that what we've come to know is those oldest coping mechanisms that were created in our lives are going to be the hardest ones to change. They've been around the longest. We've watched them for a longer period of time, no doubt. And so it's understandable that it doesn't just happen, after a workshop, or it doesn't just happen after a week or a month of working on it. It does take a lot of effort and accountability, typically, to change some of that.
And even now, it's that paying attention, what am I doing to try to create safety that I might have learned from the past versus maybe moving towards the chaos, moving towards someone being upset and allowing myself to be in that space. Kind of some of the things that we've talked about, some of the coping is an attempt to manage the outcome or to avoid reality. And the more we can live in reality, the more we can live in truth, the less we're going to need these coping strategies.
And the reality is that we've run out of time. But Debbie, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. This is a fascinating subject. In fact, I think we should have a second podcast on coping strategies, and we'll hope we could do that. We want to thank you for watching and listening today to the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that today's conversation has been helpful to you. We'd like to remind you that our website, faithfulandtrue.com, is just loaded with resources for you, as well as all of the information and online registration opportunities for our 3-day intensive workshops. The Men's Journey Workshop, which we offer every month, and the Women's Journey Workshop, which we do about 3 times a year, and our couples workshops. Check out all of that information at faithfulandtrue.com. In the meantime, we'd like to thank you for joining us, and hope that this coming week, for you will be a week filled with many blessings and with great vision.